مرحبا عن جديد. النهار الطويل تبع ميبي سيرفيس داي 2021. دولي وصلنا لاخر ويبينار.
Yes.
اخر ويبينار رح يكون مع لاتيسيا رحال. لاتيسيا هي ايكو سيستم سيرفيس فالويشن سبيشالست at Lebanon Reforestation Initiative NGO اللي هي LRI، وعندها باك جراوند بالانفايرمنتال اند ناتشرال ريسورسز مانجمنت. شاركت بعدة مؤتمرات بأمريكا لها علاقة بالتغيير المناخي. Leticia, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be talking to you about this topic today. So let me share my screen again, and then we can start. في مشكلة is that most of my presentation is in English.
لا أبداً.
No. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, so thank you again for having me and for joining today's presentation. تأجى هيك أعطيكم, I guess you already introduced me, so my name is Leticia Rahal, and let me introduce LRI, or Lebanon Reforestation Initiative. We are an NGO that started in 2010 as a project launched by the USFS, the United States Forest Service, and the Office of International Programs, IP, through the support and funding of the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. It was registered as an NGO in 2014, and it implements programs relating to climate change resilience, reforestation, integrated landscape management, environmental education and awareness, environmental advocacy and lobbying, landscape management, agroforestry quarry rehabilitation, and so on. So today I'll be giving you a very brief overview of the relationship between climate change and forests, specifically in Lebanon, what can be done and how, all while introducing you to the various efforts committed by LRI on that end, and hopefully pointing you to opportunities to engage with us and make an impact of your own. So every year, as forests are cut or burnt down, the world loses more and more of a valuable carbon sink. This carbon sink removes and stores carbon emissions and prevents them from filling our atmosphere and warming our planet. These are emissions that, of course, you know, are caused by human activity, like burning of fossil fuels, which include coal, natural gas, and oil. The deforestation is actually a significant driving force behind climate change. The loss of tropical forests is actually ranked third as the third largest source of emissions in the world. It adds to climate change that will impact increased sea surface temperature, increased droughts in some regions, increased flooding. It will allow for extreme weather occasions to occur, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and so on. And of course, these impacts will have significant consequences on human health, food production, water resources, biodiversity, and even infrastructure. In 2020, global deforestation trends were not encouraging. There was a 12% increase in the loss of tropical forests in the world compared to 2019. And these are forests that include some of the oldest and richest forests in the world that are integral to our survival on Earth, and of course, not to mention the survival of the millions of species that rely on them. Some of you might be asking, إنه كيف بس نحن سمعنا in 2020 إنه emissions dropped and the environment was doing so much better. Well, because, you know, Corona and the world stood still and everything. Well, there's some of the main contributing factors to this deforestation or loss of tree cover were forest fires and the conversion of forest lands into monocultures or agricultural areas. These are problems that are only expected to increase as world populations rise and climate change worsens. So, as you can see, not only is forest loss driving climate change, but it's also being worsened by it. It's a vicious cycle since as the climate heats up, forest ecosystems experience damage and degradation, and this in turn threatens to accelerate emissions. Last year, we saw the damage that forest ecosystems have begun to suffer from Earth's warming. We saw the horrible fires in Australia and in California that spread as high temperatures led to drier conditions and longer fire seasons. If this warming continues, the forest that we know may look a lot different in the decades to come. Interestingly and fortunately, while it's the loss of forest that drives the problem of climate change, it is their conservation and rehabilitation that might provide the solution. They are the most cost-effective solution to climate change. Through reforestation and land restoration, we assist the Earth in absorbing vast amounts of CO2, and through conservation and land management efforts, we ensure that carbon remains stored. So with this brief overview on the linkage between climate change and forests on a global scale, let's move on to climate change and Lebanon's forests in specific. And we'll start by gaining a brief understanding of the state of Lebanon's existing forests. So Lebanon in Lebanon, our current forest cover is around 13% based on a 2005 assessment. This is down from 35% in 1965. The forest cover in Lebanon is divided into three main classes. There's broadleaf, يعني مثلا oak species, coniferous like pine and cedar, and mixed forests, as well as what is titled as other wooded lands that include coniferous shrubs, broadleaf shrubs, mixed shrubs, and grasslands with trees. Oak woodlands, the Sinjan, constitute the major parts of Lebanese forest with around 42%, and pine forests occupy 20%. In addition, they contain a wide variety of aromatic, wild, and medicinal plants. Of course, many local communities benefit and depend on these forest areas for non-wood forest products like honey and pine seeds that provide them with a source of income, as well as for wood collection and charcoal production, mostly for cooking and heating. Unfortunately, Lebanon's forests face a lot of pressure. They face a lot of threats. These include land fragmentation, forest fires, pest outbreaks, agricultural expansion, unorganized urbanization, unsustainable harvesting and logging, over and undergrazing. And because of that, many species have either disappeared or are endangered. Forests have been broken down into small isolated pieces that are more susceptible to external disturbances and therefore are less resilient to external pressures. So where does climate change fit into all of this? Climate change actually significantly increases the extent to which forests are threatened by some of these factors. It adds on to the stresses of already less resilient forests. It does so in three main ways: through species migration, or the pressures that allow for species migration, pest invasions, and forest fires. So first, let me talk about species migration. As temperatures increase, forest growth, regeneration, and survival is affected. This is as water availability decreases as well through decreasing rainfall patterns and decreasing snowfall, and the soil's capacity to store water, especially during critical phases of spring and autumn, decreases. This creates unfavorable ecological conditions that lead to species migration. هلا بس بقول species migration ما قصدي إنه الشجر بيقوموا بيدبوا أغراضهم بينقلوا على منطقة تانية. When I say species migration, it means that trees, usually when they migrate, they move in groups, in stands, like a whole forest. And when they move, they establish new areas that start to take root and expand, and the original areas that existed shrink and fade away. This occurs through the assistance of wind or birds that help in the propagation of the seeds that then grow in more suitable ecological conditions or bioclimatic levels. So what's happening is that higher temperatures and decrease in precipitation are creating the need for existing tree stands to shift northwards to higher elevations, to wetter elevations, to cooler elevations. And although species migration is not an unnatural occurrence, throughout the years, forests have used this adaptation method. What's alarming is whether these tree species, many of which have a slow propagation process, will be able to keep up with the fast rate of warming that is happening on Earth and in Lebanon. And when I say that this is a threat to the trees, I'm not just saying that we're going to lose a bunch of forests. I'm saying that we're losing ecosystem services. We're losing wildlife. We're losing livelihoods that depend on them. And cedar trees, the famous cedar of Lebanon, was actually highlighted as a threatened species because of this, since most cedar forests are already at mountain peaks and will face challenges moving upwards, and this might lead to their extinction. The second way that climate change adds to the stresses of forests is through pest invasions. Lebanon has witnessed several pest outbreaks in the past years that have caused severe damage to forests. Climate change adds on to this by prompting a change in the life cycles of the pests and in their feeding patterns, where they become even more destructive to trees. This is suspected to be because increased levels of CO2 actually in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere, prompt an increase in the carbon to nitrogen balance of plant tissues, which in turn results in lower food quality for many insects that feed on leaves. So I don't know if you saw this, but I think a few years ago, there was this very famous New York Post article that went viral that talked about how there's this pest called the Cephalsa tanurinensis, which is the cedar web spinning sawfly that was attacking cedar stands in Tanurin. And that this invasion that was happening, or outbreak that was happening, was actually being increased by climate change because it was leading to earlier snow melt. And when the snow was melting earlier, it was allowing the life cycle of that pest to coincide with the growth of new cedar shoots on which it would feed on its needles. So the last threat that I will talk about of climate change on our forests in Lebanon is forest fires. And I think this is the example that you have witnessed the most probably in last year and the year before. And it's a threat that has concerned us a lot over the past 2 years. In general, the frequency and intensity of fires poses a real threat to the sustainability of forest ecosystems. Forest fires in Lebanon are usually human-made. They're caused by humans, either on purpose, or it's when they're clearing their agricultural waste and then it gets out of hand, or either where they go and they do outdoor activities that involve a fire and it also gets out of hand. And usually they happen in the fire season, which runs from April till October. And as the winter season is right after that, the heavy rain that happened after the forest fires causes soil erosion. Shockingly, 80% of Lebanese forests are threatened by fires. Due to climate change, this fire risk is increasing. As winters become warmer and summers become hotter and drier, the fire season is extended and forests become full of dry and flammable vegetation that grew throughout the winter season and then dried up in the summer. I think you might have noticed this year if you live in Lebanon, and you've seen that we were, a lot of pictures, a lot of people showing that spring was here in February. Well, although it was nice to see, unfortunately, all of this vegetation will end up being fuel for fires in the dry summer that we're going to witness. So as I said, climate change provides the right conditions for fires to spread fast and across wider distances. Not to mention that the dry wind is expected to increase in occurrence and to travel at higher speeds that allows fires to spread even faster. So as I said, in 2019 and 2020, we witnessed massive forest fires that are the worst to ever occur on record in Lebanon. And usually forest fires burn around 1,500 hectares per year, which is 2.5 times the size of an average football field. So here, if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you if you can guess in the chat box how many hectares burned in 2020. Does anyone have an idea?
So, انتوا الشات بوكس حدا بحب يكون عم يتوقع تقريبا كم هكتار انحرق بلبنان ب 2020. نحن نحكي 2019 يلي هي هزت العالم وعملت كان بدنا نقول احترق لبنان 4000. عم بتقول لارا 4000.
اوكي، في حدا تاني؟
بيير قال لك اياها كثير.
اوكي
2750. جورجي كثير دقيق.
Is that you guessed something around 3,000 hectares, then you're right. 2,997 hectares burned in 2020, which is the worst to ever occur on record in Lebanon. This is out of 7,132 hectares of total area that was burned, and this includes agricultural lands and grasslands. Oh. Unfortunately, 1,036 hectares were in key biodiversity areas. So these threats not only threaten the existence of the forests, but also the livelihoods and communities that depend on them. whether for products or for ecotourism. And they also affect the ecosystem services provided by these forests that serve human well-being in direct and indirect ways. So we looked at the impacts. We see how it will affect human populations negatively. We see how it will affect forests negatively, biodiversity, general living standards. There are so many impacts that seem impending and others that seem necessary to avoid. So the question becomes, how can we manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable? Here, those of you with some familiarity with the topic of climate change will interpret what I have just said as the adaptation and mitigation of the impacts of climate change. Let's very briefly look at the definition of these two concepts. Adaptation, or managing the unavoidable, is the process of adjusting to the current and future effects of climate change. Mitigation means making the impacts of climate change less severe by preventing or reducing the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I will now highlight some approaches of adaptation and mitigation, most of which are being implemented through LRI programs and activities. So mitigation. We're called Lebanon Reforestation Initiative. So obviously we do a lot of reforestation and land restoration. By doing this, we are planting native trees across suitable lands all over Lebanon, and thereby restoring the ability of these lands to store carbon. And we're also, by building or by planting across a forest connectivity corridor, by connecting forests together through our reforestation, we are increasing the resilience of these forests to threat, especially since larger forests are more resilient to external pressures. To prevent the further loss of forests and the release of stored carbon, we conduct fire prevention activities like pruning, creating fire breaks to stop the spread of fires, equipping communities with firefighting tools and equipment. And this is done during the fire season, during and before the fire season, to remove the flammable vegetation that I spoke about earlier, and also to create awareness on fire-inducing activities during the fire season. We also assist in managing pest invasions in forests through our forest management programs to reduce the release of carbon from decaying trees. And finally, we conduct a lot of awareness raising by empowering youth and communities to change practices and lobby for reduced emissions. As for adaptation, this can include climate smart planning. So this is something that we aim to do at LRI. Through climate smart planning and implementation, we do reforestation projects, or any project that we try to implement, we do it from a climate smart perspective. So for example, we might plant more fire resilient species in areas because we know that it has a fire risk. Or we do some research on how species distribution patterns will change as climate change conditions get worse. And then we plant trees according to where it is the ecological conditions will be more suitable for them according to climate change projections. We also plant trees in a strategic way to prevent cases of extreme flooding or soil erosion. And we apply methods of agroforestry, which I will describe a bit more in detail later on. And even in cities, these are areas that will become hotter and more difficult to live in as climate change increases. Through our urban forestry program, we aim to integrate green spaces in urban locations that not only provide benefits to the well-being of city populations, but can also ease the reliance on ACs, for example, and reduce the pressure on infrastructure through flood control. As this presentation mainly deals with forests and climate change, I focus specifically on the adaptation and mitigation methods that are related to forests. We should keep in mind, however, that climate change is an issue that crosses all sectors of society. And in order to truly tackle the problem, an integrated, holistic approach across all sectors is needed. To conclude, I would like to highlight two concepts that are indispensable in any intervention against climate change. The first indispensable component is community. Whether we are applying approaches that use forest-based actions to mitigate the impacts of climate change in general, or working to adapt and protect our forests from the accelerated risks of climate change, community is always key. Climate change is a communal problem, and therefore it necessitates a communal solution. That doesn't mean that individual action is not important. Of course, when you are mindful about your outdoor activities during the fire season, you're making a change. Of course, when you adopt a tree, you're making an impact. Or when you are attentive to the source of wood products that you consume, you are making a difference. But a problem at this scale requires a synchronized solution, first and foremost at the global level, at the level of the global community. More locally, solutions and approaches of adaptation and resilience building cannot occur without the inclusion and participation of communities. Resilient forests equal resilient communities. Not only are they often dependent on the forest lands, but also it is only through a coordinated effort with them that any proactive change can occur and any damaging or harmful activities to forests can be prevented. Communities are also key to scale up action, and that is whether they are communities in villages, volunteer communities, national and global networks, and so on. At LRI, community is an integral component of our work. We realize that it is the communities and villages that interact with forests on a daily basis, that care for the lands, and it is only through them that we can ensure the continuity of any of our projects. Through awareness sessions, trainings in pruning, firefighting, reforestation, and capacity building, we empower communities to become involved in maintaining their forests. Through roundtable discussions, we include them in the plans related to their village. This is all part of a socioeconomic corridor strategy that links communities across the forest connectivity corridor, and that has created a planning committee that manages activities along this corridor and encourages cooperation. I'm not sure if we have any members of the CPC with us today, but if we are, I'm talking about them. The second indispensable component that I would like to highlight is intersectionality. Climate change is also a problem of poverty. It's a problem of inequality, of lack of access to education, of economic crises. Focusing on the environment or forests alone without working to combat poverty or gender inequality is not enough, and it won't even come close to facing the problem of climate change. This is especially true as the impacts of climate change are usually felt unproportionally throughout the globe and often felt most in disadvantaged areas. So earlier, I mentioned how the loss of the tree cover across the world is increasing, and in large part, this is due to the conversion of lands from forest cover to agriculture as a source of sustenance for poor rural populations and as a source of income. This became increasingly true as COVID pushed people out of cities as jobs disappeared and back to their rural areas. So climate change enhances this problem by creating erratic weather conditions that often are damaging to crops and therefore creating the need for more land conversion. And I think here an example would be, I don't know if you remember, but we experienced very damaging hail in the last 2 years, I think, that ruined whole crop yields of apple in areas that depend on them. And so I'm not necessarily saying that the hail occurrences that happened were a direct result of climate change, but climate change will definitely allow for more of these occurrences to happen. And so with the economic crisis that is occurring in Lebanon, we see indicators of reverting to agricultural practices or intentions of enhancing the industrial sector. But we don't realize that this comes at the expense of our natural resources if practiced unsustainably. Private landowners nowadays are more likely to need their lands for agricultural practices than as forest areas in these difficult circumstances. At LRI, we work to integrate this intersectionality of climate change by focusing on livelihoods in all of our projects. We implement forestry projects while creating job opportunities for locals in villages and expanding their skills and capacities. For example, we employ members of local communities in reforestation, forest pruning, fire prevention activities, and we do trainings on composting and agroforestry. Through nature-based solutions, we try to create additional and sustainable sources of income in any village that we work in. We also engage in all these activities through a gender lens that ensures that women are equal participants and have access to all the opportunities and livelihood that we support that we provide to our projects. For example, we conducted beekeeping training for women in rural areas to provide them with new skills and a potential support to their livelihoods. For the issue that I talked about earlier about the conversion to agricultural lands due to the demands of poverty, what can be done about that is to improve practices. And that can be done through agroforestry, which is something that we also encourage and implement at LRI. basically, it's how you use nature-based solutions to help improve yield and work with the environment rather than against it in your agricultural areas. For example, using tree species to protect crops from extreme wind and weather conditions that will likely increase with climate change. So finally, since today is MEPI Day of Service, I would like to end by telling you that each one of us can make a change, but that you don't have to carry the burden of climate change alone on your shoulders. Individually, you can start by making the right choices that create a positive impact on your forests. For example, don't start a campfire in high-risk areas during the fire season. Of course, never litter in forest areas, and you can even support and visit nature reserves and try to attend trainings and awareness sessions to increase your knowledge. But also, you can make an impact by joining or creating communities where you live or at your job. And you can work together to try and come up in any way to try to fight climate change in your own way. So also, if you want to make a difference at a more national scale, you can come and volunteer with us in reforestation, in awareness sessions, in pruning and weeding, high-risk forest areas, and in many other ways. So if you are interested, I encourage you to check the volunteer link that I will post in the chat box. And thank you. I am now ready for any questions that you might have.
Oh, Leticia, thank you so much. يعني الواحد بيسمع بكم خبرية من هون، بس لما يشوفهم كلهم سوا البرزنتيشن قدامه كثير غير القصص. أول سؤال من دولي حابة أسألك.
Yes, thank you, Shafi. Again, thank you, Leticia. A very fruitful information and helpful, وبيكونوا incentive لكل العالم to learn from ونجرب نطبقهم. Just I have like a few thoughts أو بالأحرى concerns وبحب أعرف منك كيف عم تشتغلوا عليهم. You mentioned a lot of information or activities or actions that need to be taken and put into action actually.
Yeah.
So وقتها انتم for instance التحديات كلها وال challenges you transform them into opportunities or solutions for Lebanon, let's say. When you say you created job opportunities, all of that was through the platform اللي هي the NGO, or you were combining efforts مع other stakeholders لتقدروا تعملوا هيدا الشيء. يا ريت بتخبرينا لأنه هيدا المشكل موجود بلبنان وموجود بالعالم كمان. So best practices can be shared or to learn from your experience and share it with others. هاي أول شيء. شغلة تانية you know نحن هلا عم نفكر من اول النهار انا وشفيق والكل عم نحكي انه how to transform the challenges into opportunities و how we create the environmental social impact, the impact per se, and this impact can serve as opportunities to work through social enterprises. Where are you from that?
Okay, so for the first question, yes, Nahna, we are a project-based NGO through a lot of donor funding and project implementation. We create job opportunities for people who engage with us, for example, in reforestation or fire prevention or whatever. So OLC, jobs are being provided to them through our projects. But of course, Nahna, we want to work on sustainability. We don't just want to create livelihood opportunities for people through our projects. We want to empower them to be able to enhance and support their livelihoods on their own, even if we are not there. So Nahna, as I was saying, through our trainings, through our capacity buildings, we are equipping people with the technical knowledge and the skills for them to be able to access more livelihood opportunities or more job opportunities. So like I was saying, the beekeeping, Nahna, we trained a lot of women in a lot of rural areas in beekeeping, and I think they even provided them with some equipment. So this provided an livelihood opportunity for them. Or in ecotourism, or when we provide trainings in ecotourism, we're equipping people who to take advantage of their forest areas in a sustainable way and make an income from it. Now, the second question, do you mind just repeating it, please?
Yeah, I was saying since the morning we were talking about initiatives وكيف هيدول initiatives when working on an impact, whether any sort of impact, mainly social or environmental, لأنه we are talking هون هيدا هو المحور تبعنا. We are trying to think of social enterprise. اليوم انتو it's an NGO, okay? So are you willing to, for sustainability, to think to transform this initiative or this NGO into a social enterprise وتكونوا عندكم كل الفاندمنتالز and you are working on it ويصير في sustainability أكتر؟ هيدي هي الفكرة.
Okay. Well, for now, what I can say is that for now we are an NGO, and of course, through our work, we also aim to encourage and empower other social enterprises also through the work that we do at LRI. But to give you like a definite answer about that, all I can say that is for now we are an NGO. We aim at improving the livelihoods of communities. We aim at cooperating with other social enterprises, with local partners, with communities. But I'm not sure how to answer specifically that question.
No worries, no worries. It's very clear. أنتوا على the right track لأنه عم تشتغلوا على impact. You are the
مش تودينا الويب سايت تبعهم.
international. Exactly. So you are on the right track. يعطيكم العافية.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
يعني ليتيسيا أنا عندي سؤال إنه بنفس الوقت أنتم عم تشتغلوا أنتم كمان في ريس against time إذا بدنا نحكي لأنه كل سنة عم يصير في حرايق زيادة، عم يصير في قطع للأشجار، يعني خصوصا الأحراش بلبنان. سرعة أو مسؤولية مين إن نرجع يعني نعمل يعني تشجير أكثر؟ يعني أنا بتذكر لما صارت في حرايق قلت لهم أوكي لازم نروح كلنا سوا نزرع، قالوا لا 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 ما لازم تفوتوا على هذه المنطقة. كانت غير عقلية، لا هي الطبيعة بتجدد حالها بحالها. إذا نحن الوقت عم يسبقنا، كيف نكون نحن كمان عم نقدر نشتغل بنفس الوقت نرجع نشجر لبنان ونرجع لبنان أخضر؟
Okay, بس لازم أقول لك إنه that's true. يلي قالوا لك إياه it's true. بس يصير في حريقة, you can't just go and intervene and try to plant it. يعني you need to give natural regeneration a chance first and foremost. هيدا أول شيء لازم نعمله. So usually after fires نحن بنروح بنعمل a post-fire assessment وبنشوف إذا في signs of natural regeneration. If there are, we leave this land to do what it can do best and even better than we can. We let it naturally regenerate. Otherwise, if we see that there's no hope, we can do an intervention, preferably after 3 years. بس للreforestation كمين العاملين المسؤولية, I would say, or even for fire prevention, I would say it's a cooperative effort. يعني everyone should be involved. Whether it's government, it's NGOs, it's private businesses, private sector, everyone is involved and has a responsibility. Well, that's especially true لأنه يعني as I said, fires in Lebanon are human-made, and so يعني إذا نحن كindividuals نعمل المسؤول علينا وما منكب سيجارة مثلا بالغابة بنكون أخذنا portion of the مسؤولية. إذا نحن كNGO عم نروح عم نعمل fire prevention activities كمان we are taking part in the responsibility. Of course, the government has to have a role in this fire prevention as well through proper forest management policies and fire prevention.
نفتح مجال للأسئلة. إذا حدا بحب يسأل أسئلة please go ahead.
حطيت في سؤال بالشات بوكس.
أوكي في إيمان بتحب تسأل. إيمان نسمع أصواتهم لتيسيا. هاي إيمان. صباح.
سامعني؟
سامعك. سامعينك. من وين حضرتك إيمان؟
أحب أشكرك.
خبرينا.
أنا من مصر.
من مصر. أهلا وسهلا.
أيمن.
أنا أهلا فيكي. أنا حابة جدا إن أنا أشارك في الحفاظ على البيئة، وعجبني جدا السيشن الموجودة. بس كان عندي سؤال، إزاي إن إحنا نقدر نتطوع في حاجة زي كده، وثانيا إزاي نقدر نعمل توعية من خلال البيئة المحيطة اللي حوالينا.
كيف أنا نتطوع، كيف أنا نتطوع إلى البيئة اللي
الناس
حوالينا.
تتقبل الموضوع.
شكرا إيمان.
Okay. So أكيد إذا شي نهار إيمان حضرتك عايشة بلبنان أو لا؟
لا قلبي مصر.
لا. Okay. So ليالي عايشين بلبنان I'm gonna answer إنه you can volunteer with us. تتطوعوا معنا ب-LRI إذا بتحبوا تشاركوا ب any of our activities. بس ليالي عايشين زي ما إيمان بغير بلد. I would say جربوا تلاقوا local NGOs that you can volunteer with اللي بيعملوا شغل مثل اللي نحن بنعمله، أو حتى إذا ما في like I was saying, community is very important. You don't need to you can create your own community. You can get together with a group of friends. You can try to conduct environmentally friendly activities. You can try to see what the best way to plant some trees are. You can attend awareness sessions, trainings, and try to develop your own personal skills. فإذا ال opportunities مش موجودين للvolunteering أنا برأيي إنه فيك حتى تخلقيهم يعني لحالك.
Thank you إيمان. بس إذا بتسكر الميكروفون إيمان معليه نعمل ميوت بليز. اوكي عم بعمل ميوت انا بس مش عم يزبط، ما بعرف ليه. Okay, thank you everyone. It was an amazing webinar. Looking forward for more cooperation. ما بعرف إذا حدا كمان بحب يسأل سؤال لليتيسيا، بناخذ أسئلة قبل ما نرجع أسأل أنا آخر سؤال. يا هلا.
ما بدي أسأل سؤال، بدي أجاوبها لإيمان.
تفضل.
Your question, what can we do? شو فيك تعملي؟ Plant a tree.
Well, plant a tree according to the conditions, the scientific conditions of your environment. But yes, definitely plant trees if you can.
Plant a tree, not for the sake of planting trees, for the sake of raising awareness. Why are you planting a tree? And it will open a whole array of opportunities to explain about the importance of environment. So lead by example. This is it.
That's a very
even
good
with
point.
simple gestures, very important.
My colleague Maria Salamuni, he's also from LRI, mentioned on the chat box إنه كمان through social media, which can be an awareness tool. Here I'd like to mention, if you'd like to keep up with our activities for inspiration on volunteering opportunities, you can follow us on social media on Facebook or Instagram. Lebanon Reforestation Initiative.
Perfect. دول في شيء بعد؟ تسألي؟
لا ما بدي أقول شيء غير thank you very much. thank you على هالinformation و thank you إنه هيك عم بتخلونا بكل هالأوضاع اللي نحن فيها نشوف قد إيه في عنا initiatives حلوة وكان serve مش بس تطبق بلبنان برات لبنان. هيك شيء النقطة مضيئة بهالشوية ظروف مش حلوة.
ليتيسيا الصبح كان ضيفنا علاء وانضم لنا هلا. اول شيء بدي اشكرك انه عرفني عليكي. ثاني شغله بدي اسالك قديش مهم الاشخاص مثل علاء اللي هن بمناطق بيعرفوا منطقتهم يكونوا عم بيساعدوكم، او كمان هن يكونوا عم بيوعوا او يشتغلوا معكم.
اكيد اول شيء علاء يعني thank you for the opportunity. وإذا عم تسألني قد إيه مهمين الأشخاص مثل علاء، كتير مهمين. But yes, like I was saying بالpresentation, community is very important لأنه هن بيعرفوا الأراضي تبعهم أكتر from an external force عم يجي وعم يتدخل. So having their input, having their feedback in our projects is very important لأنه هن مثل ما قلت هن اللي بيعرفوا their forest more than anyone else. وكرمال هيك نحن وعلاء is actually a part of this. He is part of the corridor planning committee, which is committees that we have in all of the villages across our forest connectivity corridor that work with us in their areas on all of our activities. فأكيد كتير مهمين وكتير we use them in our projects.
بيرفكت. ما بعرف اذا حدا بحب بعد نفتح اخر مجال اذا في سؤال كمان. بيير تفضل.
ليك انا
سمينا اكيد.
I'm a volunteer LRI volunteer so عم بحكي so رح اقول لك شغله. نحن we were part as our NGO was part of an LRI project about protecting the forest from fires through a community approach. يحوي جوزيف هون كمان in the public شي محل. He was leading the project. The importance of the community, this is it. رح أعطيك مثل. إجا خبير أمريكاني من أمريكا وحرايق الغابات والهليكوبترز والخبرة اللي عندهم إياها، ومن 70 سنة صار لهم بيعملوا ريسيرش about forests وفورست فايرز وإلى آخره. إجا على لبنان برم كل المواقع اللي عم بيشتغلوا فيها LRI، وبوقتها كانت أزمة النفايات and they were dumping everything in the valleys، so في ريسك حرايق كتير كبيرة. اجى خبير امريكاني مكلف الوف الدولارات، وقف ما عرف شو بده يعمل. يحو مجد كان عم بيروح ويجي معه، مجد كمان معنا يحوي هون. الامريكاني قال well I don't know what to say. In the United States we protect the houses from forest fires. Here we protect the forest from the houses. So this is to say the importance of the local input. يعني نحن بنعرف كيف نحمي غاباتنا أكثر من أي واحد، خاصة at the local level. لأنه بأي منطقة فيها غابة بلبنان أهل المنطقة بيعرفوا مين اللي بيشحر، مين اللي بيعمل مشحرة، ومين المعاز، ومين اللي بيروح بيتصيد وبيعمل مشاوي على النهر. ما هودي بيعرفوا بعضهم. وإذا بدك تجيب FBI مش رح يعرفوهم، بس يعني ابن الضيعة بيعرفهم لهودي كلهم سوا. And this is important. It's about bringing theory to practice. رجعنا للموضوع الأولاني، فينا نكتب papers قد ما بدنا، بس آخر شيء you have to relate it to the field, to the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much بيير وليتيسيا. يعني النهار كان طويل. ليتيسيا ميرسي مرة تانية. بدي أقول إنه هذا نهار MEPI Day of Service 2021 خلص اليوم. بدي أتشكر كل اللي كانوا ضيوفنا اليوم، من خضر عيد علاء الهاشم، للوليا حلواني، لفرانشيسكو باخوس وملايكا صوفي، لدكتور بيير حداد ولتيسيا رحال. دولي ميرسي كثير كمان. و يعني كان لنا الشرف نستقبل كل هالشخصيات وهالشباب اللذيذين. اذا عندك شيء تقوليه.
يس بدي اقول انه ثانك يو لمبي على فكره انه نعمل MEPI Day of Service وصحيح انه اليوم خلصنا، بس بفتكر نحن بلشنا ببدايات جديده، لانه تشاركنا افكار، شفنا كيف فينا على طول نحول تحدياتنا والمشاكل ل opportunities. We tackled in one day 6 webinars فتحوا مجالات لنا على أكثر من موضوع بيعنوا بالenvironment والclimate change. كلمة climate change وenvironment متشعبة، ومثل ما لاحظنا الclosing دخل فيه الenvironment والclimate change. كل المواضيع بتتداخل بين بعضها. what we need نحن هي أكثر نكون عم نوثق بقدراتنا، ما نطلع على طول positively، نركض نعمل partnerships مثل ما حكي بيير بالintervention تبعه. نفكر على طول باللوكل، على طول نكون positive، نفكر بالcommunity تبعنا و to strive to the best. وهيدا اللي كنت حابة أقوله.
شو بقى أزيد على البريزيدنت اوف MEPI عليه هدول الشيء. ثانك يو سو ماتش. لا بالنهاية يعني ما بينزل على حكيك. جايز ميرسي كثير لأنكم كنتوا موجودين معنا كل هالنهار. بنتلاقى قريبا بعدة ويبينارز مفصلة عن هالمواضيع، اللايجريفن ليدرشيب وكمان مع دولي ومع MEPI عليه. بليز نحكوا مع بعضكم، نحكيوا مع بعضكم، تعرفنا على بعض. هيدا أهم شيء، إنه ما ننقش يعني طريقة التواصل بين بعضنا. بدي أقول لكم تصبحوا على خير، ودائما في أمل بلبنان. ما البلد ما فينا نستسلم منه، ما حنستسلم منه
أبدا.
يلا
Thank you everyone. Bye.
باي باي.
Bye.